At 43, she realized she had been living for everyone else. At 43, Aisha discovered that silence could be louder than any scream. It wasn't a sudden realization, nor did it arrive with drama or tears. It came quietly, on an ordinary morning, while she stood alone in the kitchen holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. The house was awake, but no one was speaking to her. Her husband had left early for work, her children were busy with their phones, and the rhythm of her life continued exactly as it had for years without pause, without question, without her. She stared at the steamless tea and wondered when she had stopped drinking it while it was warm. Her days followed a pattern so familiar that she could move through them without thinking. Wake up before everyone else. Prepare breakfast. Pack lunches. Make sure uniforms were clean. Answer questions. Solve problems. Smile. Always smile. Somewhere between the school schedules and unpaid emotional labor, Aisha had forgotten what it felt like to be asked how she was doing and to answer honestly. People called her strong. They admired how she managed everything without complaint. "You're amazing," they said. "I don't know how you do it." But no one ever stayed long enough to see the cost of that strength. No one noticed how her shoulders ached from carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be hers alone. No one saw how her heart felt tired, not from age, but from being unheard for too long. At 43, Aisha had learned how to disappear in plain sight. She remembered being younger before marriage, before motherhood, before expectations reshaped her into something convenient. She used to write. Late at night, she filled notebooks with thoughts, dreams, and stories that made her feel alive. She believed words could save her. Now, those notebooks were stored in a box at the back of a cupboard, pages yellowing with time, like pieces of her she no longer touched. Her husband wasn't cruel. That made everything harder to explain. He was responsible, hardworking, and dependable. But he had grown accustomed to her silence, mistaking it for contentment. Whenever she tried to express herself, he would say, "You worry too much," or "That's just how life is." Over time, Aisha learned that it was easier to swallow her words than to argue for their importance. Her children loved her, but in the careless way children love, assuming presence without noticing absence. To them, she was always there. Meals appeared. Clothes were clean. Problems were solved. She was invisible because she was reliable. And that invisibility hurt more than any argument ever could. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old drawer, Aisha found a photograph of herself at 22. She was laughing, head tilted back, eyes bright with possibility. She stared at that woman for a long time, searching for familiarity. The woman in the picture looked fearless. Alive. Unapologetic. Aisha felt a lump rise in her throat, not from jealousy, but from grief. She mourned the woman she used to be, the one who believed her dreams mattered. That night, after everyone went to bed, Aisha sat on the edge of her mattress, listening to the quiet hum of the house. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had done something purely for herself, not out of duty, not out of love, not out of obligation, but out of desire. The thought unsettled her. How had she lived so long without asking herself what she needed? At 43, she wasn't unhappy in the way people expect unhappiness to look. There were no dramatic fights, no broken homes, no visible tragedies. But there was a constant ache, subtle, persistent, and exhausting. It was the pain of postponing herself again and again, promising that one day she would matter too. She thought about how often she had said, "Later. Later, I'll rest. Later, I'll follow my passion. Later, I'll speak up." Later had quietly turned into never. The realization scared her more than any argument ever could. Because it meant that no one had taken her life away from her, she had slowly handed it over, piece by piece, believing that love required self-erasure. That night, she cried quietly into her pillow, careful not to wake anyone. The tears weren't angry. They were tired. They carried years of unspoken thoughts, abandoned dreams, and emotional loneliness. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had been holding. And something inside her shifted. Aisha didn't wake up the next morning transformed. There were no dramatic declarations or sudden courage. But there was a small, unfamiliar awareness, a voice she hadn't listened to in years. It whispered gently, almost timidly, asking a simple question. What about you? She didn't know the answer yet. But for the first time in decades, she was willing to ask. And that was the beginning. The day she realized no one was listening. The days after that quiet realization passed like any other, but something inside Aisha had changed. Outwardly, nothing was different. She still woke before sunrise, still moved silently through the house, still placed breakfast on the table without being asked. But inwardly, there was a new awareness, like a light switched on in a room she had avoided for years. Every word she didn't say, every feeling she ignored, echoed louder than before. She began to notice things she had once dismissed. The way conversations ended before she could finish a sentence. The way her opinions were acknowledged with nods but never followed by action. The way decisions were made around her, not with her. None of it was new. What was new was her inability to ignore it. One evening, while sitting with her family after dinner, Aisha tried to speak. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a suggestion about changing their routine, something small that mattered to her. Before she could finish, her husband interrupted, already moving on to another topic. Her children followed his lead, the moment passing without resistance. Aisha smiled, as she always did. But inside, something cracked. She realized then that it wasn't that people were intentionally silencing her. They simply didn't expect her to speak. Her silence had trained them well. Over the years, she had become so agreeable, so accommodating, that her voice had faded into the background. And now, when she tried to reclaim it, it sounded unfamiliar even to herself. That night, sleep refused to come easily. Aisha lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from her life she had never questioned before. The first time she had set aside her ambition for someone else's comfort. The countless times she had said it's fine when it wasn't. The relationships she had preserved at the expense of her own needs. She wondered when she had started believing that being loved meant being invisible. The next day, while cleaning the house, she found herself standing in front of the cupboard again, the one holding the box of old notebooks. This time, she didn't walk away. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the box out and placed it on the bed. Dust rose into the air as she opened it, carrying with it memories she had buried carefully. She picked up the first notebook and opened it. Her handwriting was younger, messy, but full of life. The words spoke of dreams, fears, and questions she had once dared to ask. She read page after page, her chest tightening with every sentence. This woman, this version of herself, had been brave. She had believed her thoughts mattered. She had believed she deserved space. Aisha closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest, tears slipping down her face. She wasn't crying because she missed writing. She was crying because she missed herself. Later that week, a small incident changed everything. At a family gathering, surrounded by relatives and familiar noise, someone casually remarked, "Aisha has always been the quiet one." It was said without malice, almost affectionately. People nodded in agreement, smiling as if it were a compliment. Quiet. Easy. Low maintenance. The words settled heavily in her chest. She laughed politely, but inside, she felt something shift again. She realized that the world had assigned her a role and she had played it so well that no one imagined she might want something different. Being quiet had become her identity, not her choice. That night, driving home in silence, she stared out the window and thought about how loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes, it comes from being surrounded by people who don't truly see you. At 43, Aisha felt lonelier than she ever had. In the days that followed, she began experimenting with something unfamiliar: honesty. Not dramatic honesty, not confrontational honesty, but quiet truth. She allowed herself to admit when she was tired. When she didn't agree. When she needed space. The reactions surprised her. Some people were confused. Some dismissed it. Some didn't notice at all. And that hurt more than she expected. She realized that reclaiming her voice wouldn't be easy. It had been absent for too long. People weren't used to hearing it. And perhaps, she wasn't used to trusting it either. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a cafe, a rare moment she had claimed for herself, Aisha watched people pass by. Women younger than her, women older, all moving through their lives with stories she would never know. She wondered how many of them were silently carrying the same weight. How many had learned to survive by shrinking. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, not one of rebellion or escape, but one of presence. A future where she didn't have to disappear to be loved. The thought frightened her. Change always does. That evening, she tried again to speak, this time more firmly. The words didn't come out perfectly. Her voice trembled. But she didn't take them back. The room grew quiet. Her husband looked surprised. Her children looked uncomfortable. And yet, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't resolution. But it was real. She had spoken, and the world hadn't ended. That small victory stayed with her through the night, warming her in a way sleep never had. At 43, Aisha understood something important. Finding your voice after years of silence feels awkward, uncomfortable, and lonely. But losing it forever is far worse. She didn't know where this journey would lead. She only knew she couldn't return to the life where her feelings were an afterthought even to herself. And for the first time, she didn't apologize for wanting more. When wanting more began to feel like betrayal. After Aisha spoke up that evening, the house felt different, not louder, not quieter, just unfamiliar. No one argued with her. No one raised their voice. But the air itself seemed cautious, as if everyone were waiting for her to return to the version of herself they understood. She noticed it in the way conversations became shorter when she entered the room, in the way her husband looked at her a second longer than usual, searching for something he couldn't name. It unsettled her more than open conflict ever could. In the days that followed, Aisha felt torn between relief and guilt. Relief, because she had finally expressed herself. Guilt, because doing so made her feel selfish. Years of conditioning had taught her that peace in the home came from her flexibility, her silence, her ability to adjust. Now, by speaking, she felt as though she had disrupted something sacred. She wondered when she had started believing that her needs were a threat. Her husband tried to be patient. He asked, cautiously, if something was wrong. Aisha almost laughed at the question. How could she explain something that had been building silently for decades? She told him she just needed time. He nodded, but his discomfort was evident. He was used to solving problems, not sitting with emotions he didn't understand. One evening, while folding laundry, Aisha found herself overwhelmed by a sudden wave of anger, not at anyone in particular, but at the life she had accepted without protest. The neatly folded clothes felt like symbols of years spent maintaining everything except herself. She dropped onto the bed, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. This wasn't who she thought she was. She remembered her younger self again, the woman who once believed she could be anything. That woman hadn't imagined a life where her identity would revolve around what she provided rather than who she was. The realization stung. She wasn't ashamed of her family. She was ashamed of how completely she had erased herself to keep everything running smoothly. The guilt followed her everywhere. When she rested, she felt lazy. When she asked for space, she felt demanding. When she remained quiet, she felt dishonest. There was no winning, only learning. One afternoon, Aisha met an old friend by chance at the market. They hadn't spoken in years. The friend looked at her with warm recognition and asked, "How have you been, really?" The word really caught her off guard. Aisha opened her mouth to give the usual answer, then stopped. "I don't know," she said softly. The honesty startled them both. They talked for a few minutes, nothing deep, nothing dramatic, but as they parted, Aisha felt lighter. She realized how rarely she allowed herself to speak without performing strength. It was easier with someone who didn't expect her to be anything. That night, lying beside her husband, Aisha stared at the ceiling again. The question she had avoided finally surfaced: was she unhappy in her marriage or unhappy with herself? The distinction mattered. She loved her husband. She respected him. But love had slowly become routine, and routine had made her invisible. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to be seen. The next morning, she tried to explain this to him. Her words were clumsy, emotional, imperfect. She told him she felt unheard, unseen, and overwhelmed. He listened, but his response was cautious. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said. "You never said anything before." And he was right. She hadn't. That realization hurt in a new way. She couldn't blame him entirely. Silence had protected her from conflict, but it had also robbed her of connection. Expecting to be understood without speaking was unfair. Aisha understood that now. But understanding didn't erase the pain. The tension in the house continued, not explosive, but heavy. The children sensed it. They became quieter around her, unsure of how to respond to this version of their mother who needed things. Aisha felt the familiar urge to retreat, to reassure everyone, to say, "I'm fine." But she resisted. For the first time, she sat with discomfort instead of fixing it. At 43, Aisha was learning that growth doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels lonely. It feels like standing between two versions of yourself, unsure which one you're allowed to become. She was no longer the woman who said yes to everything, but she wasn't yet the woman who knew how to say no without guilt. The internal conflict exhausted her. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, she returned to her notebooks. This time, she didn't just read, she wrote. The words came slowly at first, then more freely. She wrote about anger she had never expressed, dreams she had postponed, and the fear that it might be too late. She wrote without editing, without judgment, without apology. When she finished, she realized something profound. She wasn't asking for too much. She had simply been asking the wrong people for permission to exist. That realization both comforted and terrified her. Because if she didn't need permission, then responsibility rested with her. Change would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed yet. In the following days, she noticed resistance, not always spoken, but felt. Subtle comments. Impatience. A sense that her transformation was inconvenient. It would have been easier to retreat, to smooth things over, to return to her familiar silence. But she didn't. At 43, Aisha stood at the edge of a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. And for the first time, wanting more didn't feel like betrayal, it felt like survival. The cost of becoming visible. The first real argument happened on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that was supposed to feel peaceful. The house smelled of tea and toasted bread. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, touching the walls with warmth. It should have been comforting. Instead, Aisha felt an ache in her chest she couldn't explain. She had asked for something small. Time. "I just need the afternoon to myself," she said quietly, standing in the kitchen with her hands resting on the counter. No errands. No visitors. Just a few hours. Her husband looked up from his phone, confused. For what? The question struck her harder than she expected. For what? She wanted to say, "For me." But the words felt fragile, as if they might break under scrutiny. I don't know yet, she replied honestly. I just need space. His expression changed, not angry, but unsettled. You've never needed that before. And there it was. The sentence that carried years of expectation. She felt her body tense. That doesn't mean I never did. The silence that followed was thick. He set his phone down slowly. You're acting different lately, he said. It feels like you're pulling away. Aisha swallowed. I'm not pulling away. I'm trying to find myself. The words sounded strange aloud, almost dramatic. But they were true. He sighed, rubbing his temples. This is coming out of nowhere. It wasn't. It had just been quiet. Their voices rose not in shouting, but in emotional exhaustion. Misunderstandings piled up. He felt accused. She felt dismissed. At some point, one of the children appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed, sensing the shift. Aisha softened instantly, guilt rushing in. She hated that her awakening had begun to ripple outward. Later that day, she sat alone in her room, replaying the argument. She wondered if she had asked for too much, too fast. She wondered if this was the cost of honesty. Growth, she was learning, didn't just change you, it challenged everyone around you. In the weeks that followed, she noticed subtle resistance everywhere. Her husband became quieter, less affectionate, as if unsure how to approach her. Her children asked more questions. Friends commented on how she seemed different, the word loaded with uncertainty. Some days, Aisha doubted herself. She missed the ease of being predictable. Being agreeable had been simpler. It had come with approval. But it had also come with invisibility. One afternoon, she overheard her husband on the phone with his brother. He wasn't complaining, but his confusion was evident. I don't know what she wants, he said. She says she's unhappy, but she won't tell me exactly why. Aisha stood frozen in the hallway. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed a gap she hadn't bridged yet. She wanted to be understood, but she was still learning how to articulate what she needed. That night, she tried again. They sat at the dining table long after the dishes were cleared. She spoke slowly, carefully. She told him about feeling invisible, about losing herself in responsibility, about the fear of reaching old age without ever truly living. He listened. Truly listened this time. I didn't know you were carrying all that, he said quietly. I didn't know how to put it down, she replied. Something shifted between them, not resolution, but recognition. It didn't fix everything, but it softened the distance. Still, Aisha felt the weight of change pressing on her. Every step forward seemed to demand a sacrifice: comfort, approval, familiarity. She was no longer sure where she belonged. Not entirely in her old life. Not yet in her new one. She found herself drawn to solitude. Long walks. Quiet mornings. Writing. Reflection. In those moments, she felt whole. But she also felt the sting of isolation. Reinvention, she realized, could be lonely. One evening, while flipping through old photo albums, she stopped at a picture of herself in her 20s. She was smiling, vibrant, full of anticipation. Aisha traced the image with her finger, grief and gratitude mixing in her chest. I'm still here, she whispered to the woman in the photograph. The next day, she did something she had been avoiding. She booked a counseling appointment, not because something was broken, but because something was changing. Sitting in that room, speaking openly, she felt both exposed and relieved. For the first time, her emotions weren't being minimized or misunderstood. They were simply acknowledged. The counselor asked a simple question: what would your life look like if it centered you? Aisha didn't answer immediately. The question lingered, unsettling in its simplicity. She had spent decades centering everyone else. Imagining herself at the center felt unfamiliar, almost forbidden. But as the session ended, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: direction. Back home, the tension remained, but it was evolving. Her husband began asking different questions. Her children adjusted, slowly. Some days were harder than others. Some days she felt empowered. Others, exhausted. But she no longer doubted the necessity of her journey. She understood now that visibility comes at a cost. When you stop shrinking, the world has to adjust or resist. And not everyone welcomes that shift. At 43, Aisha was no longer asking whether she deserved more. She was asking whether she was brave enough to claim it. And deep down, despite the fear, despite the doubt, she knew the answer was beginning to form. The choice between comfort and truth. Days turned into weeks, and Aisha felt the tension inside her growing stronger, like a river swelling after rain. Her small victories, the conversations, the moments of honesty had begun to shape her life, but they had also exposed her to resistance she hadn't anticipated. The comfort she had once taken for granted now felt like a cage, warm but suffocating. Every morning, she faced the same question: should she remain within that cage, safe but invisible, or step into uncertainty to reclaim herself? She remembered the faces of her children, their trusting eyes and small voices that often demanded her attention. She loved them with all her heart, but she realized that love had been intertwined with sacrifice to a point that she had nearly disappeared. The thought of putting herself first, even for small things like a walk, a quiet hour, or revisiting her writing, came with guilt that weighed heavier than any argument ever could. It was on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the clouds hung low and thick over the city, that Aisha faced a defining moment. Her husband was away on a work trip, her children at school, and the house was finally silent. She had received a letter in the mail earlier that week from a distant relative inviting her to attend a small art workshop, a 2-day retreat focusing on self-expression through painting. It was the kind of invitation she would have laughed off in the past, claiming she didn't have time or that her responsibilities came first. But this time, she read it with a different heart. Aisha sat by the window, rain dripping against the glass, and thought about the notebook tucked away in her drawer, filled with sketches, dreams, and fragments of her younger self. It had been years since she had allowed her hands to create freely. Painting had always been her escape, a world where she could express her thoughts without explanation or judgment. The invitation stirred something inside her, a fragile, trembling hope she hadn't felt in decades. But the guilt returned immediately. Her husband might not understand. Her children might feel abandoned. And yet, the voice she had learned to listen to whispered softly but insistently, "You deserve this. You are allowed to choose yourself." She hesitated, knowing that making this choice might ignite resistance at home. A week of quiet reflection passed. She found herself anticipating the workshop with equal parts excitement and terror. She imagined stepping outside the house, feeling the wet pavement under her shoes, breathing the scent of rain, and finally being alone with her thoughts. But she also imagined the disappointment on her husband's face, the confused questions from her children, the murmurs of relatives who had always seen her as the steadfast, uncomplaining one. On the morning she decided to go, the house felt unusually heavy with expectation. Breakfast was quiet. Her husband had packed for his trip the night before, and the children were unusually energetic, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. She told herself to be calm, to breathe. The invitation to the workshop was folded neatly in her bag, along with her small travel sketchbook. When she finally spoke the words aloud, "I'm going to a retreat for a couple of days," the room fell silent. It wasn't the shock of the news that surprised her. She had expected questions, but the way her husband's eyes softened in confusion and concern. "A retreat," he said cautiously. "Alone?" "Yes," she said, voice firm, yet trembling. "It's something I need to do." He didn't argue, but he didn't fully understand. His silence was heavy, and for a moment, Aisha felt the familiar tug of guilt. But this time, she didn't retreat. She collected her things and left the house, feeling a strange mixture of fear and liberation. The city streets were wet, and the smell of rain filled her lungs as she walked to the station. Each step felt like a quiet rebellion, a declaration that her life was her own. She thought of her notebooks, the sketchbooks, the words, and the small, forgotten parts of herself she had ignored for so long. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of ownership over her own time and choices. At the workshop, the air was filled with soft laughter, the smell of paint, and a sense of calm she had nearly forgotten existed. Surrounded by strangers, all with their own stories, Aisha felt a strange freedom in anonymity. No one expected her to serve, to adjust, to smile for someone else. She could simply exist. She could simply create. During the first painting session, she hesitated, unsure of what to put on the canvas. Her brush hovered over the palette, uncertain. Then, slowly, the first stroke went down, tentative and small. And then another. Colors bloomed on the page, spreading in ways that mirrored the emotions she had tucked away inside herself for years. Frustration, sorrow, longing, hope, they all poured out in shades and shapes she had almost forgotten were hers. By the end of the day, she stepped back from her canvas, hands trembling, heart racing. She hadn't just painted, she had confronted herself. Each brush stroke was a silent act of defiance against the life she had been living quietly for decades. Each color was a reminder that she mattered, that her feelings, her dreams, her voice, were valid. When she returned to the inn that evening, she wrote in her notebook for the first time in months. The words spilled out effortlessly, documenting the small liberation of the day, the emotions that had resurfaced, and the realization that choosing herself was not betrayal, it was necessary. Yet, even in the sanctuary of the workshop, doubt crept in. She thought of her family at home, wondering if her absence would spark resentment or confusion. But she reminded herself gently, she wasn't abandoning them. She was returning, fuller, stronger, more present. For the first time, she understood a profound truth: caring for oneself is not selfish. It is essential. And the courage to step into that truth comes quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you notice that your life has shifted. As the second day of the workshop ended, Aisha stood by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked streets. She felt the weight of the past, but also the lightness of reclaiming a small part of herself. She realized that change wasn't about dramatic gestures, it was about the small, deliberate steps she took every day to honor her own needs, her own voice, her own existence. She packed her bag, ready to return home, carrying not just her artwork, but a sense of possibility. She didn't know how her family would react, or how her life would change in the coming weeks, but she knew one thing with certainty: she had taken the first step toward living fully for herself. And for the first time in decades, at 43, Aisha felt the fragile but undeniable pulse of freedom. Returning home, the ripple of change. When Aisha returned home from the workshop, the house felt simultaneously familiar and strange. The walls smelled of home-cooked meals, her children's laughter echoed faintly from the schoolroom, and yet everything seemed smaller somehow, like the rooms themselves had grown accustomed to her silence and were now wary of the change in her. She carried her bag carefully, her heart pounding with anticipation and apprehension, unsure how the family would receive the new version of herself she had discovered in just 2 days. Her husband was the first to notice. He had returned early from a business call, leaning against the doorway with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "You're back early," he said, eyes scanning her for signs of the person who had left. "I wanted to come back before dinner," Aisha replied softly, placing her bag down. There was a pause, a delicate silence that carried more meaning than words. She felt her husband's gaze, almost searching, as if trying to measure the distance she had traveled in those brief hours away. Her children ran to greet her, hugs and questions spilling out at once. "Did you have fun? What did you learn? Can we see your painting?" Their excitement was genuine, but beneath it lingered curiosity and a subtle unease. They sensed the shift, the quiet rebellion that had begun in their mother, and it made them both intrigued and cautious. Aisha smiled, answering carefully, choosing her words with intention. I had a wonderful time. I painted, I wrote, and I thought about things I hadn't thought about in years. Her husband nodded slowly. I see. His voice was calm, but she caught a flicker of concern in his eyes. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't entirely comfortable either. For decades, he had known her in one way: quiet, reliable, and endlessly accommodating. Now, she carried herself differently, and it demanded acknowledgement he hadn't anticipated. The evening settled with a subtle tension in the air. Conversations were polite, smiles genuine but measured. Aisha felt it keenly, the invisible barrier between who she had been and who she was becoming. She could feel the house itself resisting her, as if the walls preferred her old silence to this new presence. That night, she retreated to her room and unpacked her sketchbook. She ran her fingers across the vibrant colors, remembering the freedom she had felt at the workshop. She realized that even though she was home, the liberation she had experienced had not vanished. She had brought it back with her, tucked carefully into her chest like a secret treasure. Yet, the next morning, the ripple of change became more apparent. Her husband asked her to help organize the pantry, a simple request, but she hesitated. In the past, she would have moved quickly, silently, accepting every task without question. Now, she paused, her internal voice whispering, "Do you really need to do this?" "I can do it later," she said finally, her tone calm but firm. The words felt foreign, even revolutionary. Her husband froze. He looked at her, eyebrows drawn together. "Later." "Yes," she replied. "Right now, I need to finish writing." The pause was long. Then he nodded, almost reluctantly, as if acknowledging a boundary he hadn't known existed. It was a small victory, but it carried the weight of decades. Throughout the day, Aisha continued to test her boundaries in small, deliberate ways. She took quiet moments for herself while the children did homework, sat by the window with her sketchbook, and allowed herself to rest without feeling guilty. She noticed subtle resistance from her family, not hostility, but uncertainty. They were used to her being perpetually available, endlessly accommodating, and now her presence was being measured differently. Her husband approached her later in the evening, his expression cautious but curious. "You seem different," he said softly. "I can't put my finger on it, but it's like you've changed." Aisha met his eyes, her own steady. "I have," she admitted. "I'm trying to take care of myself, too." He nodded slowly. "I guess I need time to get used to this." "Yes," she said, a hint of relief in her voice. "And I need you to let me." It was not a confrontation, it was a negotiation. And for the first time in years, she felt the power of choice, the ability to define her own life without erasing her needs for others. Over the next few weeks, Aisha continued this delicate balancing act. She learned to say no without guilt, to prioritize her passions alongside her responsibilities, and to communicate her feelings without fear. She began writing every evening, painting small sketches, and allowing herself to experience joy in ways she had long forgotten. Each step, no matter how small, was a reclamation of herself. Her children began to notice subtle changes in her. She was calmer, more present, yet less immediately available. They adapted, slowly, learning that her time and attention were precious and could not be taken for granted. Her husband watched quietly, sometimes with concern, sometimes with admiration. He had known her as someone who adjusted constantly, and now he had to navigate the reality of a woman who had begun to assert her existence. One rainy afternoon, Aisha went for a long walk alone. The streets glistened under the rain, and the scent of wet earth filled her lungs. She reflected on the subtle victories and small conflicts that had emerged since she returned home. Each interaction carried the weight of change: the way she had asked for space, the way she had declined certain tasks, the way she had spoken her mind. Each act was met with curiosity, confusion, or acceptance, and it reminded her that change, while necessary, was rarely smooth. Yet, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She realized that her life had been full of love, full of care, full of devotion, but often at the expense of herself. Now, she could love fully without erasing her identity. That evening, she sat by her window, sketchbook in hand, watching the raindrops trail down the glass. Her thoughts were quiet but steady. She understood that this journey was ongoing, that the challenges would continue, and that some family members might struggle to accept the new boundaries she had set. But she also understood that reclaiming herself was not negotiable. At 43, Aisha was no longer shrinking to fit the expectations of others. She had begun to assert her existence, to honor her voice, and to nurture the dreams she had long neglected. The road ahead was uncertain, but she felt ready to walk it. And in that quiet, rain-soaked room, she allowed herself to smile small, tentative, yet real for the first time in decades. When independence sparks resistance. The days following Aisha's small victories at home were not all gentle or quiet. Change, she realized, has a way of stirring emotions in others that are sometimes unexpected. For some, her assertiveness was inspiring, for others, it was unsettling. And it was the unsettling that began to weigh on her the most. Her eldest child, 12-year-old Sarah, had begun noticing the new boundaries Aisha set. While the younger children were still adjusting, Sarah was more vocal. One afternoon, while Aisha was painting in her room, Sarah entered and frowned. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "why do you spend so much time in here? Don't you have things to do for us?" Aisha set her brush down, wiping her hands on a towel. "I do, but I also need time for myself, Sarah." Sarah's frown deepened. "But it feels like you are leaving us out. Like you don't care about us as much anymore." Aisha felt the familiar tug of guilt. "I care about you all more than you can imagine. But I also need to take care of myself. That doesn't mean I love you any less." Sarah looked unconvinced. "It just feels different." "You're different." Aisha took a deep breath. "Yes, I am different. And it's okay to feel uncomfortable when someone changes. But change doesn't mean something is wrong. It means I'm learning to be fully me, and that includes being a better mother because I'm not empty inside anymore." The explanation didn't satisfy Sarah completely, but the conversation marked a subtle shift. It was the beginning of understanding, a recognition that Aisha's transformation wasn't abandonment but reclamation. Meanwhile, her husband's reactions were more complex. Some days, he seemed to admire her courage; other days, his uncertainty manifested as passive resistance. He would ask for her help with tasks she previously completed without question, as though testing the boundaries she had set. When she declined, citing her need for personal time, he would not but carry a quiet tension in his shoulders. It became clear to Aisha that asserting her independence was not a solitary act; it had consequences, rippling through her family in ways she had anticipated, yet still felt difficult to bear. Every assertion of self required patience, empathy, and courage. One evening, her husband asked her to attend a family gathering she hadn't planned to go to. "It's important," he said. "They'll want to see you." Aisha paused, remembering the workshops, the painting sessions, the quiet time she had carved out for herself. Her first instinct was to agree, as she had always done. But she stopped, feeling the familiar whisper of her own needs. "I need to decline," she said finally, her voice steady. "I've committed this weekend to myself, and I want to honor that." The words hung in the air. Her husband's expression softened but also carried surprise and disappointment. "I understand," he said after a moment. "But I hope they won't be hurt." Aisha smiled gently. "They'll understand when they see I'm not disappearing, I'm simply taking care of myself so I can be fully present when I am with them." Even as she spoke the words, she knew the real challenge was internal, maintaining her resolve in the face of subtle resistance and doubt. Change is rarely easy, she realized. It is not a moment, it is a continuous act of courage, repeated over and over. In the days that followed, Aisha discovered a deeper layer of her own emotional strength. She noticed how small victories, an uninterrupted hour of writing, a walk alone, a painting completed, built upon each other. Each act reinforced the message that she had a right to exist fully, without apology. Yet, the resistance never fully disappeared. One morning, she overheard her husband quietly complaining to a friend on the phone, though he didn't know she could hear. "She's changed," he said. "I don't know if I like it. It feels like she's slipping away from the family." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they reflected the deep discomfort change can create. Aisha felt a wave of sadness, but it was accompanied by clarity. She realized that some people will resist the evolution of those they love, not because of malice, but because it forces them to confront their own assumptions and insecurities. That evening, she spoke with him openly, choosing her words with care. "I am not slipping away," she said. "I am becoming myself. That includes being here with you and the children fully, but I also need time for me. You don't lose me, I'm not disappearing. I'm returning in a fuller, healthier way." Her husband listened. His shoulders relaxed, and after a pause, he nodded. "I want to understand," he said. "I really do." Aisha felt a quiet sense of triumph, not because she had won an argument, but because she had stood firm in her truth while still extending compassion. The next challenge came unexpectedly, from a source she hadn't anticipated: her extended family. Invitations, casual remarks, and subtle expectations began to surface. Relatives who had long relied on her presence questioned why she wasn't immediately available for tasks, family duties, and social obligations. Some comments were gentle but judgmental: "You've changed, haven't you? It's unusual for a mother to think so much about herself." At first, Aisha felt defensive. But she realized that defensiveness only gave power to others' expectations. Instead, she chose patience and calm explanation. "I am not abandoning my family or my responsibilities," she said, gently but firmly. "I am making sure I am healthy and whole so I can be here for them in a meaningful way." Some accepted this quietly, others continued to resist, and a few never fully understood. It was exhausting, yet necessary. Aisha began to recognize that growth often creates tension, but tension is preferable to stagnation. One evening, while walking alone, she reflected on the journey so far. She remembered her younger self, the woman who had believed that selflessness was synonymous with love. She thought about the decades of quiet sacrifice, the lost moments of creativity, the unspoken thoughts, and the invisible presence she had maintained for everyone else. Aisha realized that the courage she had summoned in the past few months was not sudden. It had been building inside her all along, like a river held back by a dam finally breaking free. She understood that independence was not a threat to love, it was a foundation for it. By claiming herself, she could give herself more fully to others, not out of obligation, but out of genuine presence. Returning home that night, she found the house quiet, the children asleep, her husband reading in the living room. The familiar spaces now felt like a new canvas. They were the same, yet transformed, reflecting the changes she had embraced. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction. At 43, Aisha realized that asserting her independence did not have to fracture her family. It could, instead, strengthen the bonds that truly mattered if approached with honesty, empathy, and unwavering commitment to herself. And in that quiet night, she allowed herself to feel the subtle power of transformation, a power that was not loud or dramatic, but steady, enduring, and wholly her own. The test of boundaries. The following week brought a storm, both literally and metaphorically. Heavy clouds rolled across the sky, rain splattering against the windows in a relentless rhythm that mirrored the tension building within Aisha's household. Though she had begun reclaiming her life, change, she realized, rarely travels in a straight line. The walls she had quietly begun to erect for herself would soon be tested, not by strangers, not by distant forces, but by those closest to her. It started with a phone call from her mother-in-law. "Why haven't you come by for lunch?" Her voice was polite, but with an edge Aisha recognized from decades of subtle pressure. "Your husband and the children are busy, yes, but we thought we'd see you. You never visit anymore." Aisha exhaled slowly, trying to anchor herself. She had anticipated such moments. "I have things I need to take care of today, and I also need a little time to myself," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll come visit soon, but today I need space." Her mother-in-law's tone sharpened. "Space? Since when did you put yourself first over your family? You were never like this before. It feels unsettling." Aisha felt the familiar twinge of guilt rise, but she did not yield. "I am not neglecting my family," she replied gently. "I'm learning to care for myself so I can be fully present when I am with them." The line went silent. Then a soft click ended the call. Aisha set her phone down and exhaled. She realized that growth always meets resistance. The closer the change aligns with truth, the louder the voices that question it. Later that day, a symbolic crisis unfolded. The power went out unexpectedly during a storm, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. Aisha's home, always orderly and bright, became a labyrinth of shadows. Candles flickered across counters, furniture became silhouettes, and every sound, the creak of floorboards, the hum of rain, echoed sharply. Her children panicked slightly, accustomed to having everything under control. Her husband tried to manage the situation efficiently, moving from room to room, flashlight in hand. And then, he paused. He looked at Aisha. "Do you want me to handle it all?" he asked, the unspoken assumption clear, that she would step aside, as she had always done, and let the household function without her interference. But this time, Aisha refused. "No," she said quietly. "We can do it together. I can help." The storm outside mirrored the storm inside the house. For decades, Aisha's hands had been busy doing, smoothing over, adjusting, accommodating. Now, she was present, aware, and willing to act with intent. Her presence changed the rhythm of the home, forcing everyone to adapt to a new pattern, one where she was neither silent nor invisible. As the evening wore on, the tension grew subtle but noticeable. Her husband, used to her quiet efficiency, struggled to accept her voice in decision-making. Her children, unsure how to respond, vacillated between curiosity and resistance. And Aisha felt the heavy weight of expectation pressing against her newfound boundaries. It was in that evening of flickering candlelight that the confrontation happened. Her husband suggested moving furniture to make room for a generator that had just arrived. In the past, Aisha would have followed instructions without question. This time, she hesitated, noticing that the suggested placement blocked her preferred workspace near the window. She spoke up. "I think it would work better over here," she said, pointing. "That way, we still have access to the kitchen and the window light remains unobstructed." Her husband froze. "Are you changing how we do things?" he asked, tension creeping into his voice. "I'm suggesting a small adjustment," she said calmly. "It doesn't have to be a debate. I just want us to consider this too." The room grew quiet. Her children watched, intrigued. The storm outside raged on. And in that charged atmosphere, Aisha realized the truth she had known but had yet to confront fully: asserting herself would always create tension. Sometimes, people would resist not out of malice but out of comfort with the old order. She stood her ground, gentle but firm. "I am part of this household too," she said. "My input matters. I am not here to disrupt, we are all learning to adjust together." The generator was moved. The room regained its order. But the emotional shift lingered. Her husband looked at her, a mixture of admiration and uncertainty, realizing for the first time how much she had internalized over the years and how fully she was now stepping into herself. The storm outside eventually passed, leaving the streets slick and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Inside, Aisha sat near the window, watching the last raindrops fall. She felt the exhaustion of the day, but also the deep satisfaction of claiming her voice when it mattered most. That night, as she wrote in her notebook, she reflected on the storm, both literal and emotional. She realized that life would continue to challenge her boundaries. Resistance would appear in subtle ways: questions, comments, gestures, expectations. And each time, she would have to decide whether to yield or stand firm. But she no longer doubted her ability to choose. The small acts of courage, the deliberate decisions to assert her presence, had built a foundation stronger than she had imagined. At 43, Aisha understood that independence is never a solitary journey. It is a series of negotiations, confrontations, and small victories. It is tested in the quiet moments, in the storms, in the resistance of those we love. And yet, every act of self-assertion strengthens the soul, creating a life that is authentically one's own. As the house finally settled into silence, Aisha felt a quiet triumph. She had faced resistance, asserted her presence, and discovered a resilience she had nearly forgotten existed. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. Change is uncomfortable, boundaries will be tested, and the journey to selfhood is both fragile and unbreakable. In that quiet night, she allowed herself to feel the subtle power of her transformation. She knew the road ahead would continue to challenge her, but for the first time, she felt ready to navigate it with confidence, courage, and love for herself and for those who truly mattered. The conversation that changed everything. The days following the storm were quieter, almost reflective. Aisha noticed the subtle shifts in the household. Her husband no longer questioned her small decisions, her children began to seek her presence rather than assume it, and the house felt lighter. Yet, she knew that true change would require more than small acts of courage. It demanded honesty, confrontation, and a reckoning with long-held assumptions. One evening, her husband approached her as she sat by the window, sketchbook in hand, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the room. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that caught her off guard, a softness that hadn't been there before. "We need to talk," he said gently, taking a seat across from her. "Really talk?" Aisha nodded, heart beating faster. She had anticipated this conversation for weeks, but the reality of it still felt overwhelming. They had tiptoed around her changes, tested boundaries, and navigated resistance, but this was the first time he was asking for an honest dialogue about their relationship, their family, and the life they had built together. "I want to understand," he continued. "I see you changing. I see you taking space, prioritizing yourself, and I don't always know how to respond. I feel like I'm losing the version of you I knew, and I'm afraid I'll lose you entirely." Aisha felt the familiar pang of guilt, the whisper of old habits telling her to apologize, to reassure, to diminish her needs. But she stopped herself. Instead, she took a deep breath and allowed herself to speak her truth. "You're not losing me," she said softly but firmly. "I'm becoming more of myself, the part of me that has been hidden for years. I'm still your wife, still a mother, still part of this family, but I'm also Aisha. And for the first time, I'm allowing that person to exist fully." He absorbed her words in silence, eyes tracing the curves of her face, the lines of worry that had softened into determination. I didn't realize how much you've held back," he said. I thought you were happy. I thought we were okay." "We were okay," she replied. "But okay isn't always enough. I was surviving, not living. I was meeting expectations without expressing myself, and I lost pieces of who I am in the process." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I see that now," he said. "And I want to support you. I don't know how. I don't want to hurt you, but I also don't want to lose what we have. Aisha reached out, taking his hand in hers. Supporting me doesn't mean I'm abandoning the family. It means I'm stronger, more present, and able to give more love because I'm not empty inside. The room fell silent, not in tension but in understanding. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a shared truth that love can grow deeper when both people honor their needs, their voices, and their individuality. In the following days, this conversation became a turning point. Aisha noticed a shift in the household dynamics. Her husband began to ask her opinion on decisions he previously made alone, genuinely listening to her perspective. The children started to mirror her confidence, learning from her example that personal boundaries were not threats but tools for mutual respect. Even extended family began to notice the change. Comments that once carried judgment were met with calm explanations. Aisha no longer felt the need to defend herself aggressively, her quiet strength was enough. She realized that authenticity has its own language, a language that communicates more powerfully than words or apologies ever could. One evening, she took a long walk alone, reflecting on the journey so far. The streets were quiet, the scent of evening rain lingering in the air. She thought about the workshops, the small victories, the confrontations, and the moments of doubt. Each had contributed to the foundation of resilience she had been building. She also recognized the importance of patience. Growth, she understood, doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds gradually, in small steps, in repeated choices to honor oneself. It is tested, challenged, and sometimes resisted by those we love most. But the reward, clarity, strength, and authentic connection is worth the struggle. Returning home, she felt a quiet triumph. The house, once heavy with expectation and obligation, now felt alive with possibility. Her family was adapting, slowly but surely, to the new rhythm she had created. The balance was delicate, but it existed. That night, as she wrote in her notebook, Aisha reflected on a profound truth: the courage to assert oneself does not come from defiance but from necessity. It comes from the recognition that to truly love others, one must first honor oneself. Her husband joined her quietly, sitting beside her, watching her write. There was no tension, no demand, only presence. In that simple act, Aisha realized the depth of change not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, steady evolution of relationships built on honesty and respect. She smiled softly, thinking of the journey ahead. Challenges would continue to arise, doubts would return, and resistance would appear. But she felt ready. She understood that transformation is not a destination, it is a continuous practice. And in practicing presence, honesty, and courage, she could navigate the uncertainties of life with grace and confidence. Aisha knew she was still evolving, still learning, and still asserting herself in ways that would continue to ripple through her family and her world. But for the first time, she felt whole. Not perfect, not untouched by struggle, but whole. And in that quiet, reflective moment, at 43, she felt a deep and lasting sense of peace. Not the fleeting peace that comes from avoidance or submission, but the peace that comes from living authentically, boldly, and unapologetically. Becoming whole, a journey complete. The morning sun broke through the curtains, spilling warm light across the living room. Aisha sat quietly, sipping her tea, feeling the gentle rhythm of a home that had begun to adjust to her transformation. The months of change had not been easy: resistance, doubt, subtle conflicts, but each challenge had been a stepping stone toward clarity, authenticity, and resilience. She thought about the journey she had embarked on, starting with a quiet decision to prioritize herself. At 43, she had discovered the importance of carving space for her own growth, even in the midst of familial obligations. That space, once claimed, had allowed her to reconnect with long-neglected passions: painting, writing, reflection. But it had also revealed the emotional currents running through her family: the fear, confusion, and gradual acceptance that comes with witnessing someone evolve. Her husband entered the room, his presence calm and unassuming. He had grown quiet in his admiration for her persistence, learning to embrace her individuality without perceiving it as a threat. I made breakfast, he said softly, gesturing to the tray he carried. Aisha smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Thank you, she replied. For everything. He set the tray down and sat beside her. For the first time, conversation between them flowed without the weight of resistance or uncertainty. They spoke of small plans, children's schedules, shared responsibilities, and even dreams that had been quietly buried over the years. The atmosphere was lighter, infused with a new rhythm, one where mutual respect and understanding replaced expectation and obligation. The children came bounding in, excitement on their faces, and Aisha noticed the subtle shift in them as well. They were adapting to her presence as a whole person, not a version diminished by self-sacrifice. They asked questions, shared stories, and even noticed the sketches on her table. Mom, can we try painting like you? Sarah asked, curiosity and admiration in her voice. Aisha laughed softly. Of course, she said. We can all create together. The afternoon passed with simple joys. Painting, storytelling, and laughter filled the spaces that had once been quiet with obligation. The house, once heavy with expectation, now felt alive with possibility. Aisha observed the subtle changes in her family dynamic, recognizing that her journey had not only transformed her but also provided an example for her loved ones. By honoring herself, she had invited them to explore authenticity, boundaries, and the quiet power of presence. Later, as she stood by the window watching the sunset, she reflected on the months of transformation. She thought about the workshops she had attended, the small acts of rebellion she had initiated at home, the conversations that had challenged old assumptions, and the moments of fear and doubt she had faced. Each had been necessary, each had been a step toward the wholeness she now felt. Aisha understood that transformation is not linear. Growth is a spiral, revisited over and over, deepening with each iteration. Her journey was ongoing, and she embraced that reality. The fear that had once accompanied self-assertion was no longer paralyzing, it was a companion, a reminder of courage tested and strength discovered. That evening, her husband suggested a family dinner outside the home, a symbolic act, small but meaningful, to celebrate the subtle but profound changes in their household. Aisha agreed, not out of obligation, but from a sense of agency. She felt present, engaged, and fully herself, able to participate without sacrificing her boundaries. As they prepared for the outing, Aisha's mother-in-law arrived unexpectedly. There had been tension earlier in the journey, subtle resistance to her independence, but this time, Aisha approached with calm confidence. I'm glad you're here, she said, warmly but firmly. We're heading out for a dinner together. Her mother-in-law's expression softened. For the first time, she seemed to recognize that Aisha's choices were not acts of defiance, but steps toward authenticity and balance. There was no confrontation, no tension, only recognition and quiet respect. At the restaurant, laughter, conversation, and connection filled the evening. The family shared stories, small victories, and reflections on the past months. Aisha observed the subtle changes in her loved ones, their curiosity about her inner world, their appreciation for her presence, and their gradual understanding that self-care and family care were not mutually exclusive. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house settled into silence, Aisha sat by her desk with her journal. She wrote freely, capturing the emotions of the day, the joy, relief, and quiet pride she felt. She reflected on the long journey from invisibility to presence, from quiet obedience to assertive authenticity. Her husband joined her quietly, placing a hand on hers. You've changed our lives, he said softly. Not just yours, but ours too. You've shown us that it's possible to love fully while honoring oneself. Aisha felt a deep swell of emotion. It wasn't easy, she said. There were moments of fear, doubt, and resistance. But I've learned that the greatest courage is in choosing yourself without fear of judgment. He nodded. And in choosing yourself, you've shown us all how to live more fully. In that moment, Aisha realized the full magnitude of her journey. She had not only reclaimed her identity, but she had also reshaped her relationships. The balance she had sought was fragile, evolving, and tested, yet it existed. She understood that true empowerment comes from embracing oneself fully, navigating resistance with patience and empathy, and living authentically even when the world is unsure of how to respond. As the night deepened, Aisha looked out at the quiet streets below. She felt gratitude for her life, the struggles, the victories, the lessons, and the love that had remained steadfast even amidst change. She understood that the path to selfhood is rarely straightforward, often met with fear, doubt, and resistance, yet every step is a testament to courage and resilience. At 43, she allowed herself to feel complete not in a perfect sense, but in the sense of wholeness that comes from living honestly, embracing boundaries, and nurturing both her individuality and her family connections. She knew that challenges would continue, that boundaries would be tested, and that growth is ongoing. But she also knew she was ready to face life fully, authentically, and with unwavering courage. Aisha closed her journal, a small smile playing on her lips. She understood now that true transformation is not measured by dramatic events or external recognition, but by the quiet confidence of a woman who claims her voice, asserts her presence, and nurtures her own soul. She had become whole, and in doing so, she had illuminated a path for those around her, showing that it is never too late to reclaim oneself, to love deeply, and to live fully. And in the stillness of that night, surrounded by the soft breathing of her family, Aisha allowed herself to rest, at peace with her journey, her choices, and the life she had courageously begun to create.